That we're here for our first session. For those of you that are joining us in here today for the first time, welcome to the conference, and I think you're going to enjoy the opportunity to hear from three people that are on the front lines of this story and can tell us quite a bit about it. I've asked each of the panelists to take a few minutes and present some thoughts on a particular area that they're interested in. And I'll give you a more extended introduction of each of these folks in just a minute. But just, I'd like to just give you a quick introduction of who we have and a couple of general questions. Rob Collier is with us from the Goldman Institute at UC Berkeley, Lisa Margonelli from the New America Foundation, and Tom Whipple from the Falls Church, Virginia News Press. Let me just ask a question to all of you. The peak oil story. Is it a difficult story for you to write about, or in the business of analyzing what other reporters are writing, what do you observe that's difficult for reporters who are pursuing the peak oil story?
Well, I think as for reporting, it depends on the price. Many readers and certainly many editors have the feeling that, well, the law of the market is the ultimate proof, and if there's a peak, then the prices will go sky high. Now, there's clearly a lot of validation for that, apparent validation for that, and attention given to the oil story a few months ago when prices were sky high. Now that they're going down, it's a lot tougher, for just very short-term reasons. And I think reporting on this issue really does depend, I think, on what all of us pay at the pump.
I think there's an issue, like it's very hard to pitch stories about gravity. I think that one of the issues with peak oil is there's kind of two aspects of the peak oil story. One is a very dire sort of the so-called theory with the a time frame for when this is going to happen, and the other thing is a massive shift in the behavior of the oil market and the availability of fuel from especially from non-OPEC producers who have a different behavior than the OPEC producers. And the second one is really about gravity. I mean, there's been this massive shift in the behavior of the oil market and where the new oil is coming online from. And so virtually, people don't necessarily use the peak oil brand when they're talking about oil in the articles, but the reality of this shift, I think, is, we're soaking in it, basically. So I guess the question is do peak oilers, is it important to you to see your brand in the paper, which is sort of what I've been hearing? People want to hear peak oil, or do you want to hear massive shift in availability of resources and huge changes coming down the pike?
Or reduced dependence on foreign oil. That's basically, there's an awful lot of code words around for the same thing. Somewhere early on, the whole business got a slightly doomerish aspect to it, and a lot of editors don't necessarily want to talk to this thing, but almost everybody is talking about this thing now in some way, shape, or form, and the current political campaign is basically they're saying we have to get ourselves onto some other solution here. That's what it is. I think the overriding problem is it is not a particularly pleasant story if you take it a couple of generations beyond, oh my goodness, the price of gas went up another 10 cents today or something, which is where most papers are stopping. And if you take on another layer or two of analysis, it becomes a very serious story. I just don't think too many people are willing to tackle it now.
A question that I asked in the first panel, just to hear some different responses. Last year in Houston, oil passed $90 a barrel on the way up. A lot of us thought it was going to pass it in the other direction last week. It came close. not quite, but prices are down a great deal from the $147 a barrel peak. I'm wondering if the three of you expect this story, which has gained some traction in recent months and years, if you think that the reporting, the focus on this story is going to go the other direction if oil prices remain, relatively speaking, low over the next several months or year.
I would say yes. I think it's basic. It's one of sort of the fundamental laws of physics and short-term media attention, in that if people aren't hurting and screaming, and if there's good news, then why look for bad news? Now, don't ask for any more sophistication than that. It's a superficial formulation, but that's, I think, a very powerful dynamic in media attention.
I think another dynamic in media attention has to do with how simple the idea is. And on the one hand, one aspect of peak oil is very simple. You can say, hey, it's going to peak and everything's going to change. That one gets a little bit of play. But I would say that the larger story of what makes high prices or what makes low prices is very complex. And it's, there's a tremendous number of competing stories between rising GDP in parts of the world, a lot of subsidies or lack of taxes, massive changes in the availability of the resources. All of these stories are very complicated, and people really don't want to hear them. And frequently, I get phone calls from people who say, well, can you tell us why prices are up? Is it speculators? And I say something like, well, it's not really speculators. It's a tremendous number of changes, including machines that trade oil in the middle of the night, that base their trades on momentum. And then there's kind of like, I think we're going to call somebody else. And I think I'm feeling weird. And so, I think that this is really, the news cycle is really driven by simplicity and partly by fulfilling people's expectations rather than giving a really sort of complex picture of a very complex situation.
I am very upset worried about what happened last week in the whole financial market thing. I know this isn't this is the session going on next door, but I think there's a fairly good possibility here that the whole peak oil story could get itself totally lost in whatever happens with the financial markets. Everybody from the Secretary of the Treasury to the President, everybody else was extremely upset last Thursday and put a sort of a massive way of life-changing bill is up floating around Congress right now. And we don't know whether it's going to do any good or not. It may or may not pass. There's certainly an awful lot of kickbacks starting to formulate to it. And I'm very worried that the whole peak oil thing energy story could get just totally lost in here. As a lot of people in the whole peak oil business have said for a number of years, it is quite possible that if the whole world economy goes south for any period of time, demand will be down so low, nobody will care about oil peaking anymore. It just simply won't be there. Another take.
Great discussion in the lounge before these panels started. And this question's inspired by something that Tom was talking about down there, but I'd like to just ask it of all three of you. Tell us what you see as a very underreported peak oil story. What's a story in the American media that is very underreported? And Tom, I just want to start with you on that one since you had something to say earlier.
All right, thank you. Well, one of my hobby horses reporting on this whole business is, whether we all know it or not in this country, the entire world, not the entire world, but large pieces of the world are shutting down. The lights are going off. And this is, you hardly read anything about this anywhere in the U.S. press. You start all the way across the subcontinent of Asia, from Pakistan to India to Nepal to Thailand to Bangladesh to Vietnam, are faced with very serious blackouts. Pakistan is just about out of business. Their textile industry is just about totally stopped. You can't say how bad the situation is. I have sneaking suspicions that unless the Indians get their act together, there are going to be major setbacks to their GNP shortly. Subcontinent of India. Look at all the islands in the world. There are a number of websites out there. I think my favorite is energyshortage.org that I look at every morning, that sort of goes across the world and collects stories from a lot of papers we don't read, most of them in English, a few in French and Spanish, which they provide a little bit of translation. And it's basically saying all the world's small islands are closing down. These guys cannot afford oil at $100 a barrel, much less $140 a barrel. And the boat that brings the oil that runs the generators, this isn't coming anymore. So that's shutting down. You've got the same problem across large swath of Africa, unless they happen to produce some. Even some of those that are producing aren't doing too well. And you're seeing this in parts of Central America and other parts of Latin America. I don't think there's any appreciation the extent to which the whole world is dimming.
Well, one of the things that really struck me in the last 2 weeks is the whole drill baby drill phenomenon. And that and Pitbull with lipstick, I just keep thinking about that. But anyway, I got to switch tracks. The issue with drill baby drill that's really interesting is that if you go to any country in the world that has significant oil resources, say you go to Iran. I've talked with the government economists in Iran, and they will say very clearly, well, there are three schools of thought here. One is that we just keep teetering along, producing maybe, I don't know if they're like around 3.5 million barrels of oil a day, and just kind of wait it out. The next theory is that we increase dramatically, we increase maybe to 6 million barrels a day so that we're getting more of these rich prices that are coming in. The next theory is we produce lots more oil so that we become a swing producer and we can rival Saudi Arabia. Can they do that? I don't know. I think Ali Samsam Bakhtiari, who used to be a participant in this community, would say they can't do that. But it's definitely something that they discuss. And then the third thing is, why don't we just sit on the stuff and hold it, because it'll be worth a lot more later. And one of the things I don't understand about the U.S. is, so we have, we're using 25% of the current supply, we have 3% of the reserves, and wouldn't we want to sit on that stuff? Wouldn't we want to leave that stuff in the ground and pull it out later when we need to make antihistamines, or when we specifically need it for specific tasks? Wouldn't we want to play our cards the way our so-called adversaries are? And that, to me, is, missing in this. The whole offshore drilling debate got turned into an environmentalist versus Americans. And and that was, is not a very, it's a common circular argument that we make, but it's not getting us anywhere. And I think that was quite underreported.
I think one of the underreported aspects of this whole story has been the rise of China as a major consumer and driver of prices both up and down. I think in part this story is underreported because China's consumption data and import data is so non-transparent. In other words, it's so murky. It's very hard to figure out exactly what the Chinese are importing or to make any sort of accurate predictions. But the importance of China in the oil price roller coaster in the past few years really cannot be overestimated. Since 1993, when China became a net petroleum exporter for the first time, the country's oil consumption has grown by an average of about 6% annually. And it now accounts for at least 1/3 of the world's growth in annual oil demand. China's oil consumption is likely to continue expanding by 5, 6, 7 or more % a year. Just this year, in the first 7 months of this year, total net oil product imports rose 8.4%, which is about more than 35% of world total oil demand. Now, one of the interesting factors that I have not seen fully examined, in part because of the non-transparency of the whole affair, is that there are a lot of anecdotal reports that China's net oil imports have plummeted dramatically after the Olympics, which coincides with the plummeting world price of oil. This because China is widely believed to have been stockpiling oil for the Olympics. As part of kind of a bunker siege mentality, they're worried about all sorts of plots around the Olympics, so they're stockpiling oil, and their imports rose 8.4% in the first 7 months of this year, leading up to the Olympics. And that now, according to various news reports, China's oil imports have almost stopped. The International Energy Agency still predicts that China's oil imports will go up only 5% this year, but it says it just doesn't know. A recent report by the IEA said China's demand trends remain remarkably opaque, posing a considerable risk to the demand forecast. Remarkably opaque means we have no idea. Now, of course, the reason why China's oil imports are on such a broad upward trajectory is the Los Angelesization of China. China is becoming a nation of car addicts, just like you and me, just like California. China, which of course had been a nation mostly of bicycle riders, is quickly becoming a nation of car drivers. China's annual average growth of passenger automobile sales is going up 24% a year. China's expected to overtake the United States as the world's #1 car-buying nation by 2015. So this is an incredible trend, of course, as China's economy keeps booming. The Chinese people want Western-style, American-style prosperity. They're bombarded by ads with quintessential sort of Western-style, American-style automobile ads where, macho driving off into the sunset. This is the future for China, and this will continue driving world oil prices, whether China's immediately buying or stockpiling or halting its imports. You'll see a lot of ups and downs that are not easily understood because of the lack of transparency in Chinese oil data.
Let's get into a little more specific analysis with each of these three folks. I'm going to start with Tom Whipple. If you're relatively new to peak oil studies, you might wonder why we asked a guy from a little paper in Virginia to sit up here. You've heard the phrase hardest working man in show business. Tom is the undisputed hardest working man in peak oil. And the Falls Church, yeah.
I was going to get up early.
And the Falls Church News Press might not be huge, but it has a demographic in suburban D.C. That thinking people would really long for.
30,000.
Tom puts out the Peak Oil Review, the Peak Oil Daily. He's the first stop for many people on this issue on a daily basis. He spent a career working for the CIA. I should specify that's the Central Intelligence Agency. I live in Napa County, so that means Culinary Institute of America. But Tom wrote the president's daily briefing, in fact, for some time. So Tom, you're going to tell us something that's classified and top secret, right?
No secret. Yeah, that was so long ago I can't remember who the president was. You don't even remember.
All right. Well, in lieu of that, I think you have some thoughts. I think you have some thoughts about the Washington Post, and just if I could prompt you on one thing, a lot of us in the West, I don't think we quite grasp the centrality of the Washington Post.
I'll tell you a little bit about it here in a couple of seconds, but thank you for the introduction. First, I'd like to leave you with the notion that the reason we're here today is probably because the media is not really doing what it should on this story. If the media were, cranking out daily stories, as how close we were to some sort of, major economic crisis here, derived from oil, we wouldn't need to be here. There wouldn't be an ASPO. But they aren't, and we are. I think our major quarrel with them, those that do mention peak oil, is simply not giving much of a warning as to the proximity of problems, which I think we'll hear in the next few days here are fairly close. I think we're really talking about months, not decades, as other people like to think, and that sort of thing. Now, I'm going to talk a few minutes here, just a few minutes about the Washington Post. I want to dwell on them. But one of the reasons for it is that I've been, in the last couple of years, I've been up to Capitol Hill quite a bit. I sort of serve as sort of a slightly pseudo-ASPO representative around Washington, mainly because I get up there for $2 rather than, $500 worth of airfare. Jump on a subway and go up. And my perception from talking to some members, but more staff people up there, is they're very ill-informed about the whole topic. Then you ask yourself, why are they ill-informed? Well, it's because what they read. Well, what do they read? Well, 98% of them, maybe not, have to at least glance at the Washington Post every day, whether you like it or not. So I think the message here is the Washington Post has an outsized impact on what the government thinks, which, it's not necessarily members of Congress, it's all the hundreds of thousands of people that support the Congress and the government. Basically everybody, from the janitor on up is going to read the Washington Post every day. And it is what until recently has been their total lack of coverage of this issue, which has bothered me considerably. And somewhere along the line, like one of the previous speakers, I too have taken a shot or two at the ombudsman. I didn't really hear back from them, but maybe we'll take another shot again one of these days. I think to do this. Before we get too much further, I think you'd like to point to a couple things about the media in general. I think we all know that our mainstream media is somewhat in trouble. They're shedding staff at a good pace, and this sort of thing. I think the Washington Post let something like 30% of its reportorial staff, the reporters, go somewhere in the last year or so. At least we've had farewell parties that wave goodbye to a lot of them and that sort of thing. And as one of our previous speaker pointed out to me, the Wall Street Journal has something like 6 guys dealing with oil in the world. The Washington Post got 1 guy. Now, I just went back to look at what he's been doing, and the guy's really working pretty hard. Believe it or not, he's cranked out 30 stories in the last 6 weeks, since the end of July, which I think is fairly productive. And he covers the usual stuff. He talks about OPEC, he talks about the hurricanes, he talks about the financial crisis, he talks about drill baby drill, and there's just there is a lot to do. But which tells us there's a lot of reporting going on the whole oil energy business, but it doesn't quite get to the peak oil business, and that's what the problem is. I think my major concern with it is just the total, ignoring of the fact that we have a very, very, very serious problem here, and we are probably, very few months away from this thing. And something, with the impact of the Post had said almost nothing about this thing. As far as I can see, and I watched it very carefully, the last thing until this summer, the last thing they reported was an op-ed by Daniel Yergin saying peak oil is a crock, and that's the last thing they said about it. They then went on for 3 years until this summer, and at the height of the oil spike prices, where the whole world was running around hysterically, airlines were dropping out, and congressmen were, everybody was posturing all over the place. They did a 3-part series. Now, the peak of the oil prices was, I think, something like the middle of July 11th, if I remember correctly. By the time you do a 3-part front page story, a 3-part story to run the front page with umpty thousand words and edit it and go through all the editorial process, it was 2 weeks later, at which point prices were probably down by 50 cents. They didn't need to run the whole thing. But I'll give the guys credit for it. They did a reasonable job of talking about the whole thing. I think, however, from our point of view, the major point here is they did, in this 3-part series, mention the words peak oil. And I think I extracted the quote here for you. and it was buried way, way down, 40 or 50 paragraphs deep, and it was about a little teeny paragraph about this line, and they said, some analysts argue that peak oil production has already been reached, okay? Others say peak oil remains a ways off, perhaps not very far. Though capital spending by big oil companies has picked up again, the pace of the last couple of years, spurred to higher prices, exploration is still falling short. And that's sort of it, i.e., it is still sort of poised as he said, she said. Some people say it's already happened. Other people say it's a ways off. Now, exactly what a ways is, would be damned if I know. But that is sort of the last and most official word the Washington Post has said about that. However, I do note that this morning they had an editorial which, believe it or not, bemoans low oil prices, which I thought was quite interesting. The point of the editorial was it's going to knock off conservation. As we said a little while ago, up there at 120 to 140, people were conserving left or right, down to 100. All the psychological urge to conserve is off. And I think if I read the thing carefully enough, they're sort of advocating somehow we put a $110 floor under oil or something to keep us all going. We'll see. So, I think, again, just to wrap up here, I think that my major concern is that, at least this part of the media is really not fulfilling its responsibility. To my way of thinking, this is sort of like, missing the run-up to the Civil War or something, and not reporting it until Fort Sumter's bombarded, or missing the run-up to World War II, not reporting anything until Pearl Harbor is bombarded. And I hope we'll see some sort of change in this, but that is sort of the state of the world right now. With that, I pass it on to my colleague.
Let me tell you a little bit here about Lisa Margonelli. Probably one of the hardest things to do right now would be to write a unique book on oil. I've certainly been thinking about that for about 5 years and haven't come up with one, but this is one. Oil on the brain is not just a condition that a lot of our spouses think we have right now by spending 20 or 30 or 60 hours a week on this issue. Lisa's book, Oil on the Brain, Adventures from the Pump to the Pipeline, is very different from anything else you're going to see in this peak oil literature. And it's really not peak oil literature, it's an analysis of the oil industry that takes her from a gas station in San Francisco all around the world. It's really fascinating reading. Lisa's with the New America Foundation. She's published in New York Times, LA Times, San Francisco Chronicle, Atlantic Monthly, Salon, and Wired. It's a fairly long list. Right now, she has an interest in some of the limitations or problems with alternative energies and solutions. Now, she was going to talk for a moment about one issue, but I just wanted to ask you to comment on one item in your book, because this is a pretty simple line, but I think it's really important for people to understand if they want to understand this issue. The sentence is, there is no such thing as cheap gas. What do you mean by that?
Well, cheap gas is pretty much considered a right by American taxpayers and American people. It is part of our sense of who we are, is that we can get in the car anytime and go either do NASCAR or pull a Jack Kerouac and drive across the country, or that we can live in a home that feels like it's in the country and we can work in a job that is in the city. That extends to all sorts of, that's a belief that's held by people all through the class system. You go back in your own family history, in the 60s, I think 45% of marriages or something were proposed in cars. My grandma chose her boyfriends based on who had a car. You can really go a long way with this. But basically, cheap gas has always been a myth. I mean, somebody's always on the other end of the pipeline. It might be cheap when you go up and you swipe your card. The funny thing about the way we buy gas is you swipe your card and you don't even see the money go, and you don't see the gas come into your tank, which is why people think that the tanks are ripping them off. But And back when we first bought gas, you pumped your gas into a clear glass sphere up ahead, and then you pressed a button and it emptied into your tank. So you got to know that there was gas actually going in your tank. That's all invisible now. It's just this weird transaction that happens, and you drive off, and you don't even know you have gas. So that is, and we pay $4 a gallon, and we're freaking out. But there are a lot of other costs. There's probably 50 cents a gallon in asthma costs. There's huge amounts per gallon in terms of protecting the supply infrastructure with the military. And then there are just these costs at the other end of the pipeline that are incalculable. You go to the Niger Delta, where they've got 1,000 battle-related deaths a year in an area that's about the size of England. They have a death rate that's higher than Chechnya. It's basically, it's a lukewarm war. They're verging to hot probably this week. And that is all caused by a lack of environmental security, a lack of social security amongst the people there. And it all is pretty much what's happening at the other end of the pipe. And more we have to reckon with that. And one of the things about Tom Whipple's dispatches every morning is, if you're on the West Coast, you get up at like 5:30 or something, you open it up and you say, oh my God, what are they doing in Nigeria again? And then later on through the day, they say that the attacks on the pipeline have sent the price up. And then you see the price of oil up, and then you see that again reflected at the pump later on in the day as the price at the pump crawls up, so that your gas station owner isn't having to buy more expensive oil today than he's selling you tomorrow than he's selling you today. And so you end up in this situation where we are actually intimately tied to people at the other end of the pipeline, and we don't yet calculate that into the cost of doing business. We don't calculate the loss of human rights or crazy elections or just a generally bad way of managing an economy into our sense of our own security, but we're eventually having to. So basically, I don't think there is anything such as like cheap gas. I don't know, do you want me to keep going?
No, yeah, but I want you to touch on one other theme too.
Okay.
You described the approaches to peak oil as a conspiracy approach and what you just called a more thoughtful approach. And I wonder if you'd distinguish between those two.
Okay. I think I need to back up briefly and just talk about oil and conspiracy in American politics, especially since 1973, but ever since Ida Tarbell wrote her book in the 1890s, there has been a strong thread of a connection between oil and conspiracy. In the beginning, people said it was Rockefeller who was controlling the oil industry, and then it became the Seven Sisters. And now it's this whole fabulous conglomerate of conservatives might say, oh, environmentalists keep us from building refineries, and that's why the price is so high. And progressives might say, well, the oil companies are ripping us off. Actually, everybody says the oil companies are ripping us off. There's a group in Congress that is trying to sue OPEC because OPEC is holding us over a barrel. And, the moral of all of these conspiracy theories is that we are powerless to control things in the face of this giant conspiracy that's forcing us to buy oil at their prices. And that, I think, is highly problematic in terms of, that's one of the reasons that you see such passivity and such demands for simplicity on the part of the news-reading public. But the other thing is, to get back to what you were... Yeah, the conspiracy aspect of peak oil is that reporters hearing about peak oil will tend to classify it as another conspiracy theory, partly because you can't disprove peak oil. I mean, it's the classic test of the scientific theorem. Can you disprove it? And if you can't disprove it because it's partly based on secret information that's held by the government of Saudi Arabia, or it becomes something that reporters can't themselves verifiably track down. And I think if you earnestly go out and you try to read Hubbard, which I have, you come to the point where you say, well, I'm pretty, I work pretty hard, and I know what an oil reservoir is kind of like, but I'm not a reservoir geologist, and I actually don't understand exactly what he's saying. I understand the general theory. Then there's this sort of the political reality of peak oil. So there's this sort of slightly conspiracy-oriented, the oil is going to run out on January 7th crowd. And then there's this other sort of softer thing about, the non-OPEC oil reservoirs are draining. It lays basically in OPEC hands with nationalism. It's a whole different world. And how that plays out is it's a very, very serious story. And what happens is people tend to dismiss the concept of peak oil or leave it out of their stories because they're afraid, basically, they're afraid that everybody puts their Nikes on and the alien spaceship doesn't show up on January 7th. You know, I mean, it's a big, you don't want to tie yourself to some sort of crazy date. So I think that's one of the issues.
Robert Collier is a colleague now, I guess, at UCLA and Davis. We would call it the Berkeley campus. At Berkeley, they call it the University of California. At the Goldman Institute, the Center for Environmental and Public Policy, focusing in particular on climate issues, and as is already apparent, his focus and interest is on China. But he has a long history as a reporter. Long before coming to academia, he spent many years throughout Latin America covering some of the hottest spots and the nastiest conflicts down there. He's especially interested right now in energy issues as they relate to both South America and China. I stepped a little bit on his prepared remarks by asking that question about underreported stories because China was the focus, but I do want to go back and have you elaborate or add any thoughts that you'd like.
Well, thanks, John. I am focusing my research now in my writing. I'm writing a book on China's role in global warming. And to me, China's importance in this whole issue is not simply as a consumer of energy, but as a huge factor, if not the deciding factor, in the environmental issue of global warming. And I know that there's a conference on peak oil, and I won't digress too much, but I really do think that this is more than simply a strictly energy issue, but this is the defining environmental issue of our time in terms of human survival. I mentioned earlier that China currently accounts for at least 1/3 of the world's annual growth in oil demand. It also accounts, by the latest calculations of Lawrence Berkeley Lab, 37% of the world's annual growth in greenhouse gas emissions. Now, in reality, that means that its annual increase in greenhouse gas emissions is about 210 million tons, which is more than 500 million tons, which is more than twice the total cutbacks mandated by the Kyoto Protocol on all developed nations, including the United States if it were still a member. The total commitments of those nations is 210 million tons of greenhouse gases. So even if the United States and all other Western countries were abiding by their commitments under the Kyoto Protocol, which of course they haven't even come close to doing, China's annual increase would simply bury those efforts. And so this is, some people can use, and indeed have used, as the Bush administration have used this scenario of China being the world greenhouse gas emissions superpower as cause for more China bashing. Well, the problem then is China, then that lets us off the hook morally. Well, I think actually it creates much more of a moral and practical imperative forcing us to, and calling on us in the United States and other developed nations, to help China, coax China, browbeat China into greening its economy, in becoming less energy intensive. Now, it is true that just a little more than 10% of China's emissions are caused by the transportation sector. So even though oil is growing very, very fast, oil consumption in China, most of their emissions are from the energy and industrial sectors, meaning coal, which is outside the purview of this conference. But even though Chinese industry is growing incredibly fast, and coal consumption is growing at about 16 or 17% a year. Still, the rate of increase of China's transportation sector and its oil consumption is a major factor in world oil markets and is an environmental risk and threat for the world in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. As I mentioned, the Los Angelesization of China is proceeding apace, fueled by the perfectly legitimate dreams of 1.3 billion Chinese. You know, the new Chinese dream looks suspiciously like the old American dream. It involves personal freedom, 4 wheels, and that's freedom, isn't it? Well, writ large, it is roiling the world energy markets, and it is really an environmental danger for the world in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. And only if we can convince China to do not as we do, but as we say, in other words, green their economy, please, will there really be any hope to avoid the climate tipping point of global warming, wherever you put it, 450 parts per million, 380, it doesn't matter. We're heading for it very fast, and China has now muscled us aside from the wheel, and is now putting the pedal to the metal. Just as we're having second thoughts about, well, maybe it might not be such a great idea, now it's China's turn to enjoy material prosperity in the old-fashioned way, in the old-fashioned dangerous way, which I think is, well, as we know, both in terms of energy prices and in terms of the environment, is such a huge danger.
We have a lot of time left, which is the way we wanted it. We want to hear from you. I'm going to do this Jerry Springer, Phil Donahue style so the microphone doesn't get too far away. Let me start where I start my Monday mornings with clusterbleepnation.com. Hi, Jim.
Hello. Robert, that was a strange statement, because for a lot of reasons. One is we're not giving any evidence to anybody in the world that we're serious at all about dealing with our carbon, being hostages to carbon. I don't see any chance in the world that we're going to persuade China to behave differently. On the other hand, I think it's a somewhat fatuous idea that the Chinese are going to be able to carry their program of Los Angelesization much further. They have something like, 22 billion barrels of reserves of their own oil. So they're as dependent on oil imports as anybody else in the world. I mean, the only thing that I can really imagine is that, and I've said as much in my writing, that they are physically proximate to places in Central Asia where there are oil, and they are going to go adventuring for it. That, of course, would cause a tremendous amount of instability in the world and a lot of consternation. But I think the idea that they're going to be able to, that the assumption that they can even continue this is just a dumb idea. I don't see it.
No, really, how do you feel?
It's just completely. It's completely nuts. I mean, any more than the idea that we're going to be able to continue living the way we are. Well, okay, so let me just bottom line it. I'm sorry, and I'm sorry if this is abusive. I'm just a little cranky today. I'm really sorry. But what makes you think that they're going to be able to continue this project of suburbanizing China? It seems crazy to me.
Well, let me, if I can remember this correctly, let me. You made there's a couple questions embedded. Let me take them from the start. First of all, we're not doing anything. Well, first of all, California is starting to take some real policies. We are in California, and I think we should be proud that our government is at least starting to try to conserve energy. Second of all, I think we, as in the United States, if that's how we define we, Certainly under the Bush administration and the current Congress haven't done squat, but things may change somewhat in the after January 21st. And there's certainly reason to believe that something will change. In terms of why China would follow our lead, first of all, the new Kyoto negotiations are happening and are supposed to come to a conclusion in Copenhagen in December of 2009. They probably won't, but that's when they're supposed to. There's increasing diplomatic pressure and the threat of unilateral trade sanctions, sort of green trade sanctions levied by the European Union, who's actually more concerned about the competition from the United States than from China, but it would include China, essentially a carbon import tax to help protect their industries. So China is worried about that. Canada's talking about the same. Australia's talking about the same. And even within the latest Lieberman-Warner legislation, which will be the template for the next year's legislation in Congress, there was a green trade tariff in that. Well, but this is real. It's not.
What makes you think that they even have access to the kind of petroleum they need?
Well, that's your third. Let me get to your third comment, please. I was addressing your first two questions. The third question is, well, if there's peak oil, then they won't be able to get it. They won't be able to use more oil because there won't be any more oil, is the short version of your question, as I understood it. And the Chinese are getting rich. They'll buy it. And they'll drive the world prices up and up and up, and they will buy it. And they have the money. That's how. They have $1.8 trillion in reserves right now, and they will continue spending that and being the world's producer and investor and consumer.
So your answer is they're going to outbid Europe and the United States for the rest of the oil in the world?
Okay. Hard act to follow. Public debate and public policy are coupled, sometimes tightly, sometimes not. But I wanted to know what your feeling was on the panel on something that has not yet happened, which is the coupling of the peak oil conversation with the climate change or global warming conversation. We're going to react to peak oil one way or the other. Some means of reaction are a positive, some a strong positive, some a weak positive for climate change. Others are absolutely and positively disastrous for climate change. Coal to liquids, tar sands, oil shale are all disastrous from a climate change point of view. And I have almost, even within the peak oil community, I see relatively little joining of these two dominant concepts. I think these are perhaps the two major policy points going forward.
Can I answer that a little bit? One of the things is that there's a little bit of tension between peak oil and climate change, where peak oil's like, the oil's going to run out really soon, and then the climate change, people say something along the lines of not soon enough. And there is this kind of tension between them. And basically, they have been a little bit balkanized. The peak oil crowd is a little different than the climate change crowd, and they're going to different conferences and they're talking on different websites, but they absolutely have to join up. I think that there is a real growing center of gravity. We absolutely have to, every policy that we do from now on has to be one hammer that hits four nails. And it has to address consumption here at home. We have to be able to control consumption as part of a foreign policy strategy, as part of a greenhouse gas strategy, as part of a peak oil strategy. And that's just the way we've got to go. But there needs to be more joining up. And I think that as the sort of groups leave their balkanized areas and get out, and as peak oil becomes more of a gravity theory rather than a specific date-tied theory, that will start to happen.
I'll just give one quick anecdote reinforcing what you said. A couple of years ago, when I was put on a joint panel, one global warming, one peak oil, and I did my peak oil pitch. At the end of it, the guy sitting next to me absolutely savaged me for 10 minutes with a stream of vituperation. And what I sort of figured out was what I was saying, not out loud, but I was saying quietly, you don't need to worry about global warming. Peak oil will take care of it all. Especially when you start looking at the charts and going down, there's going to be less and less emissions from something or other. But you had the exact point. It's not soon enough. That's what the message is.
Hi, folks. This has been a very interesting panel. And Tom, I was intrigued by your comment about the high prices of oil and the shortages in developing countries and their faltering economies. And so it's kind of interesting because that's exactly the opposite of our current debate here on China. So if you were...
It's not a poor country.
Well, it's the opposite. Right. So if you were going to write a briefing for the president on that, what would you say? What are the geopolitical and economic implications of developing countries not being able to afford oil and having their economies falter?
Well, it's quite simple. It's absolutely horrendous. I think you're going to see places full of people, full of millions of people like Pakistan, in an awful lot of trouble in a matter of months. They already are. Somebody blew up the Marriott yesterday, and that sort of thing. That's just the beginning of the troubles there, sort of thing. Remember, this crowd's got atomic bombs floating around the landscape back there. This thing could totally deteriorate. As far as I can see, they're getting electricity, a small number of hours per day across the country, and it's got no future. And you can extrapolate like this thing all the way from Iran, who's got the same problem. Actually, the Iraqis have the same problem too. Iran that's got the same problem to right across the subcontinent, and you're just going to see, great quantities of political instability in these places. People have gotten used to a certain amount of, what we call civilization, which is mainly electric lights and this sort of thing, but it's become more. It's become, refrigeration, it's become water systems, it's become water pumps. The reason you have these mega cities of 20 or 30 million people all over towards the world now, if somebody's got a water pump there to get a water to them, they probably also have some level of sanitation. They got some ways of putting fuel in there. I'll tell you another problem that worries me concerning, I keep reading about, is these places have gotten to the point as soon as you get a mega city, forget about chopping down trees. The nearest forest is 15 miles outside of town. You're not going to go out there and collect firewood anymore. So what are you, keeping dinner warm on? Well, in the bulk of the cases, it's propane. These places are just dripping in propane. This stuff is A, running short, and B, becoming so expensive that people simply cannot afford it. You're clearly going to see massive health problems develop, all over the world, and it's starting right now. This is really taking place. Sure.
Yeah, we talk about peak oil, we talk about permaculture as being taboo subjects. Shouldn't we add not only conferences on climate change and conferences on peak oil, but conferences on population? I have not heard in any of the conferences I've been to, since 2000, we've added 550 million people to the planet, the population of Germany every 12 months, and nobody says a word about it.
All right.
Do we have a carbon problem? Do we have a pollution problem? Or do we have a population problem?
Well, I don't know how unpleasant I want to be, but when the oil age started, there were 1.5 billion of us running around. There's now about 6.4 billion of us running around, and the odds are pretty good we're going to be moving back towards 1.5 billion, and that sort of thing. You could do the China thing with one child per family if you want a state policy. They're the ones rather I know of any kind of a policy on this sort of thing. You could do the Western model when you get 3 cars, 2 houses, and a townhouse, and you only have 1 or 2 kids. The drops. But outside of that, there's not much to say except the unpleasant as the topic is, we're probably going to lose an awful lot of people, probably mainly through illness that I talked about a couple of minutes ago. You're probably just going to see lack of sanitation, malnutrition, et cetera, et cetera.
While you pass that, one of the items that I've found a real useful teaching tool on that question is that equation that John Holdren, the physicist, came up with about 35, 40 years ago. I equals P times A times T. Environmental impact equals population times affluence times technology. And if you can get people to learn that, and in the basics, it's not that complicated, you start understanding those interactions a little bit better. And that's kind of the thing Collier was talking about with the 32 times living standard as well. So, Rob,
in many ways, the most environmental policy ever invented or enacted in the history of the human race has been China's one-child policy. If China had not enacted that in the early 1970s, China would have more than 300 million extra people in its population. Factor that into your greenhouse gas emissions, factor that into your oil use, coal use, etc., and also factor that into China's, an additional driver of China's foreign policy in terms of its needs for resources. I think, getting back to what the gentleman asked back, he was almost begging the question of, are there going to be resource wars? Well, of course there are going to be resource wars. I mean, there already have been resource wars, but there will be more resource wars over shortage of oil. You know, the old saying of, how did our oil get under their desert? Well, there's going to be much more of that.
I think, can I say one
this afternoon, in my words to one of our founders, to give him hell. And that, of course, is completely stupid. This group, in my opinion, probably has greater brain power than any organization of people of like size that you can imagine, not excluding the United States Senate. I want to raise the problem that eats at my gut, that I spoke at Texas and continue to speak at, and that is, it is not the problem of the writers in this room of our failure, and it is a failure of ASPO. The problem is the goddamn editorial boards of American newspapers and their employees, because each of us has seen brilliant things on the op-ed page of his own paper, no matter where, that have been written by people that know what they're talking about.
Let's go back. Let's do this in order, or it dissolves into anarchy. So I'll people that are raising their hand.
I've had my say.
Okay, thank you, Gene. We appreciate that, Gene. You have a question.
Thank you. I'm kind of heartened by the way this discussion has gone, though, because I'm from Los Angeles and part of a small collective called Studies in Global Justice. And back in spring of 2006, we did just what some of you at the panel have said needs to be done, which we linked the entire problem the world is faced with and put on a 6-week, every other Sunday, 3 hours a session class called Converging Storms, the Crisis of Energy, Capitalism, and the Environment. The fact that this is now, because back then in 2006, nobody was doing that. We did it in LA and had about close to 100 people. And then did a shortened version at the United Teachers of Los Angeles a little later on in the year. And then repeated it this spring. Out of this, we have about 50 people chomping at the bit to start trying to do something in a positive way. And we're up here to kind of put that out there because one of the things they want to do mostly is an idea of a public utility for energy, California, like the Department of Water and Power in Los Angeles, which is a public utility. Put it in the commons, energy, in order to deal with these whole issues of peak oil and the environment.
Thanks for your question.
Yes, thank you. My question is to anyone on the panel. The apparent loss of democracy in this country and the Constitution over the last, say, 35, 60 years seems to coincide with our forced requisite to consume energy that is destroying the planet and doing all the other things that we're talking about here. With respect to China, is it the same force that acted in this country is acting there, and is it something that we can do something about?
If you talk to people in the Chinese government, they'll tell you pretty pretty much point blank that if the party wants to remain in power, they need to keeping the energy coming. They have a responsibility to make 10 million jobs a year. That's a huge number of jobs, and they need to keep people happy. They've already got, 72,000 reported riots a year. So, there's a pretty simple equation of energy equals kind of keeping the peace. But I would say here, energy also equals keeping the peace, because when energy prices get high, we tend to throw the bums out of office. I just want to sort of follow up one aspect that doesn't get talked about, and sort of a plea for complexity, is 20% of China's energy comes to us in the form of fake Hermes handbags and other crap, deck chairs and badminton sets and stuff like this. And we are underestimating our dependence upon foreign oil. We're underestimating the importance of that pipeline that comes from China because we don't see it. It's on tanker. Well, now I'm looking at your shoes, sir, and I'm thinking that they're Merrell's and they were made in China.
All right, strip. Let's see what you got on. Take it all off right now.
Every shoe in the room was probably made in China.
That's right. Yeah, is in terms of China, I think that obviously the Chinese dream is not the same as the American dream, but it's very, very similar, and there are different, of course, cultural differences. And for another discussion, it would be interesting to have a discussion over the differences, say, between, different countries' concepts of prosperity. Again, that's a different discussion. Right, but of course, they're different parts of the world have different ideas of what the good life is. There's more European concepts, there's more American concepts, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We can have a long conversation about that. And really, in many ways, what we have to, in a way, if you will, preach, or at least help cooperate with the Chinese on, is helping show that prosperity does not necessarily mean American wastefulness. You can have other types of prosperity and other types of happiness, if you will, and economic growth. You can green the concept of economic growth. We cannot preach to the Chinese or to anybody else, or to ourselves even, that we all must put on hair shirts and live in poverty. That's not going to fly with anybody. We have to figure out how to green prosperity.
Let's go to a different question here.
I'm a reservoir engineer, petroleum engineer. 2 years ago, I became a believer in peak oil, to the extent that I started a radio show about 6 months ago dedicated to this. And I get a lot of tough questions, so I'm here to learn from you. Tom, you mentioned that it is probably months and not years that we'll probably see the oil shortage. We've got a flat production right now, and I appreciate you elaborate on that.
Well, I'm probably not the one to elaborate. We're going to hear lots of expertise the next 2 days around here. You're going to hear some of the greatest minds in the world on this topic, talk about this stuff. But not make something silly. Not here today. We're just talking about press. But you'll hear another day. The general thesis is, the mega projects folks. You're going to hear from Chris Kabowski and others that say, you've probably got another 24, 36 months before, essentially all over. And the real, this flat plateau really starts going down, and they'll give you, chapter, story, and verse, project by project in much detail, and hopefully convince you that, it really is a month situation. It's not a 2 months. We're looking more like, 24, 36, I don't know if all goes well, 48. The only thing that I can think of that intervenes in this stuff is if, this bill that's going through Congress, something goes bad next week up there, and the financial stuff comes unglued. The money market funds close down. The credit cards won't work anymore. If our credit cards cease to function, there's going to be a lot less gas sold. I'll tell you that much very quickly. In which case, the demand is going to go way down, and we may never notice peak oil. We'll have so many other problems.
Tom, let me follow that up with something.
The distraction theory.
You wrote a few months ago, you wrote, loose paraphrase here, but that by 2012, we should prepare to have about 50% less oil available for our cars. Am I saying that right?
That sounds pretty, rapid to me by 2012.
Okay.
It's only 4 years from now. But clearly, you've got a combination of the world production peaking, and then you've got West Texas's thesis of world exports starting to drop, and this sort of thing, and they clearly are. They started to drop, and these two trends are going to accelerate. We're going to have less oil here in America. There's clearly no question about this stuff. Even if world oil doesn't peak, there's going to be less here 3 or 4 years from now, and that's basically what this conference is all about. Here are all the details of that down there in the next couple of days.
New question back here.
Two very short comments about the cheap cost of gasoline. I have the impression that if the United States public had to pay for the war in Iraq at the gasoline pump, we'd be out in a hurry. And the second thing is that I'm a deep believer in peak oil. I've been studying the thing for a long time. But I think one of the confusing things in the whole oil thing is to look at petroleum in terms of dollars per barrel. A barrel of petroleum is very real. A dollar used to be very real. It's only worth about 50% of what it was 8 years ago, and it's on the way to becoming garbage. I've lived in Argentina under inflation, and I think that the United States has seen nothing yet. These $700 billion that Tom Whipple talked about, and the $1 trillion Iraq war, and all sorts of, in the $500 billion deficit this year is going to drive the dollar into zero, basically. I think it's confusing to talk about petroleum in terms of dollars per barrel.
I had a question. Tom, you mentioned that the Washington Post is read by the folks in D.C. quite a bit. And with the discussion of gravity and the talk about maybe it's a big focus point, the image of a swirling black hole comes to mind. I don't know if that's right or not. But do you see that as something that the army of local groups and subscribers and members of the local groups of the peak oil movement could be brought to bear for urging the Washington Post to take any action there?
I think clearly, yes. We've heard an earlier speaker here today talk about writing to the ombudsman. It's the sort of thing we all should do. I'm probably a little, lax in my responsibilities for not taking more of a run at them and this sort of thing. Now, they're not the only ones in town. If you're more of a little ready persuasion, we have the Washington Times and there are other papers floating around. The Examiner's there now. But, and people do read the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, all that sort of thing. They read their home papers, too, on Capitol Hill. But as, one publication that sort of, covers the waterfront there, I would think the Washington Post has outside influence on how the federal government thinks. And that's why I'm quite concerned on what they say, because it basically does show up on everybody's doorstep in the morning, whether you like it or not. And it's sort of mandatory reading for people with substantive responsibilities there. And my theory, I may be totally wrong, but my theory is until the Post gets it, Washington won't get it. Until Washington doesn't get it, you're probably not going to see, policies move as fast as we'd like them to see.
Tom,
Suggestion for how the grassroots groups can help you in your efforts to bring them on board?
It's possible. I presume, you sort of email letters at them. I think the ombudsman's a good idea. We had a spokesman this morning said the ombudsman's name's all over the, go to the website and find the ombudsman's name. Shoot them letters and this sort of thing, and just say, you basically think the Post, which theoretically influences Capitol Hill, the administration, and every other government bureaucracy downtown, needs to pay more attention to this issue and take it more seriously.
Tom, we had that blurb up before the first panel. Yeah. The Wall Street Journal, the Wall Street Journal is read by the people who run the country, and the Washington Post is read by the people who think they run the country.
Yes.
It's
sort of cute.
And the Falls Church News Press is read by people who understand peak oil.
30,000 people.
I'm just curious what the role of the Journal is in Washington, the Wall Street Journal. I mean, is it influential at all, or is it more just an indirect thing?
I really can't. I don't even know what the circulation figures there. I'm sure it's around. I'm sure it shows up in every congressional office. But the one thing I learned in all my time with the government, which I think is a basic thing, you're not interested in getting number one. You are interested in getting to senators and members of Congress and secretaries of this, that, and the next thing, or what you're interested in is getting to their staff. because all these guys do is sign a piece of paper and go to the damn party and talk on the phone to each other and this sort of thing. The real thinking and the real preparation of this policy is done by, 10,000 or 20,000 or 30,000 or 100,000, middle-level bureaucrats, mostly whom are well-educated and this sort of thing. They're quite capable of preparing some sort of coherent piece of paper about what we should do, and prepare a piece of paper what we should do all day long. And these are the people that you need to get to. These are the people who have got to start understanding these things, whose mindset has to be changed, and eventually this sort of, what we sort of think about here will filter its way into the way governments think, and maybe people's stuff will start happening.
Question from the front row here.
No.
I'm going back to China, though.
It's not going to happen.
This is my question's for Rob, and it kind of goes back to China. But given the need of the Chinese to keep the peace and 10 million new jobs every year, and the possibility of a global slowdown, and the demand for deck chairs, as you say, what do you think the Chinese government is prepared to do to keep things moving? I've heard about their desire to invest all the money they've accumulated into infrastructure and things like that. Have you heard any of that?
So keep things moving in which sense?
Well, just keep creating new jobs and keep their economy perking along at whatever it's growing at, like 10%.
Well, a whole bunch of different ways. First of all, the Chinese are the world champions of infrastructure. They build infrastructure like nobody ever dreamed of building infrastructure. They put together the equivalent of the U.S. interstate highway system in just the past decade. It's phenomenal. It's mind-blowing how fast they build things. 24/7. No. It's infinite. I mean, they can keep going as long as there still are things,
Places
raw
lacking
materials.
pavement.
And it's a country also of not to be sort of culturally deterministic about it, but it's a country of 1.3 billion Chinese. And there's a culture of hard work and just investment at all levels.
There's an add-on to that, which is China is going simultaneously in both the right direction and the wrong direction, in my opinion. Shanghai is going from almost nothing in a way of a subway system, and in a few years, 8, 9, they will be the world's largest subway city by virtually every metric. They are electrifying, I'm quoting from memory, I'm a little vague on this, I've written it up, 20,000 kilometers of rail lines. They're going to be building an additional 20,000 or so rail lines and speeding up and double tracking the rail lines they have. These are all the type of things I personally would advocate according to what to do. But as he said, they also built an interstate highway system in addition. So they're going in both the right direction and the wrong direction simultaneously, in my point of view.
Hi, this is actually a question, but I'm here to promote my my TV program, Petro Apocalypse Now, which is on CBC tonight in Canada. Basically, a quick anecdote. When I took it to Cannes in February, basically I showed it to a lot of people. The offers came in. The first offer was from Al Jazeera, an Arabic channel. The second one was from the Norwegians. The third one was from the Venezuelans. The fourth one came from Canada. Now, there's of course all these countries are oil producers. Yeah. Now it's been sold at PBS in America. All the states pretty much that have bought it are also oil-producing states. It's pretty obvious that basically the media in the consuming countries and the consuming states and basically the consumers are terrified of this peak oil business, and there's no upside for them to report on it. So, to quote Colin Campbell in the film, he says, there's nothing new about this. Look at the events leading up to the Second World War. Anyone with eyes could see it coming, but they tried to evade the issue until the troops are at the door. What's going to stop the denial? When are people actually going to be able to face up to the facts? The media, there's nothing in it for them to report this. Anyway, so that's that. And also, just a quick plug, If anyone wants to review the film for their blog or newspaper or anything, I've got 10 copies here. So if they could, see me, or if they're interested, just grab me.
Let me add one thing to the question. Most people in here have probably seen the end of Suburbia and probably remember that short sequence on media with Jim and Richard Heinberg. And Heinberg makes that quick comment, there's no upside for the major media in reporting this story. Is there starting to be, kind of, I guess we're asking the same thing, is there starting to be some sort of an upside? I mean, we're seeing it in the Wall Street Journal. What's the upside for them to be reporting about this? Yeah. I mean, is there now an upside to them reporting?
I think the upside is actually coming from a strange place, which is that the U.S. is really falling behind on the green technology business. And so what's happening is that there are groups of clean tech investors and green tech people and this sort of stuff, and they're actually kind of creating, and they're very much among the people behind the climate change initiative in California. I mean, there is sort of a new a coagulation of interest, and for them, pushing peak oil and pushing global warming as stories, it translates to something. There's an upside there. So that is definitely an emerging interest that affects the telling of the story, but I don't think it actually affects the individual reporters so much as it affects the sort of the zeitgeist that the story lands in. I don't know, what do you think?
I don't know. I have been thinking about this. I'm not quite sure what the answer is. I can see an upside to this right now, this sort of thing, unless it's the general, moral imperative to warn people about this sort of thing. This is the responsibility of the press. This is what they're here for. These are stories they're supposed to tell. And, they're sort of abrogating the responsibility by ignoring all this. That's the only thing. It's free press. That's what I think so.
I'd like to get across the idea that we're now in the midst of an economic crisis, and the economic crisis is closely linked with oil prices, and when we have an economic crisis, the price of oil goes down. So what's the best way to get the point across that the two are connected? Because it's not apparent to most people.
This one?
I don't know. They're sort of connected in the minds of oil traders right now. They ever see anything like the lock between oil and the Dow Jones? Dow Jones goes down, oil goes down with it. Dow Jones goes up, oil goes up with it. A couple of weeks ago, it was going the other way, by the way. And this is basic in the perception of people, that are doing the oil trading and the buying and this sort of thing. Right now, fundamentals of the oil market seem to be totally being ignored. Hurricanes, gas shortages, Nigeria, OPEC, anything you want to see. The market's not paying a bit of attention to it. They're basically just watching the Dow and following that. And how long this goes, I don't know. All I know is I'm pretty sure we've got a fairly important week coming up in America. That's all I know. And how it comes out, that's anybody's guess right now.
Most Americans, when they hear the politicians talk about energy independence, drill more, all they're thinking is the price of gas is going to go down and they're going to have all the gas they want. When Congress talks, Congress seems to be focused on creating green jobs and jobs in the energy sector, and votes primarily on that, how many jobs they can bring home to their own districts. How do you overcome these special interests? Candidates want to appeal basically to the voters to drive down prices and give them all the oil that they want, not anything else. Most people have a 5-second attention span. All they want is cheaper gas, and Congress wants to create all sorts of programs that bring jobs to their districts.
Look, this is the primary season. This is the time when you can get them to listen. We just really have to change what we're willing to sit and listen to. And that means that if you're a Republican and you're going to the convention, please don't shout "drill, baby, drill." It means that we all, this is consciousness raising. And it might be the old-fashioned kind of consciousness raising of the 60s where people meet in groups and people meet in Los Angeles and they have these meetings and they prevail upon their elected officials. It might be something that's a lot more like marketing. It might be something more like the incredibly fast spread of the sort of hipness of the Prius, which is actually kind of a funky looking car. That became a hip statement. It might have to do, there's a lot of things that we have to do. And we have to make it unacceptable to talk about energy independence when you're just talking crap. And we need to make we need to make those things unacceptable, and they're not. They're perfectly acceptable. They're what we want to hear right now. So it's up to us.
I mean, I would say, politicians are not on drugs. I mean, they're logical people, and but they're responding to the polls. They're responding to their own personal immediate need to get reelected. And the polls show that people, don't care about the things that most of us here in this room care about. And so I don't think sort of demonization of, it's easy to demonize the media and easy to demonize politicians, but to a certain extent they are us.
We're out of time here.